Hello, welcome to another edition of C-Vision International Thought Leadership Cybersecurity Podcast. Today we're joined by the team from Noname, and I'd like to give them a chance to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Karl Mattson. I'm the CISO for Noname Security.
Hi, I'm Tesauro. I'm a distinguished engineer at Noname Security.
David Sharp, advisory board member.
Wonderful. Thank you for being with us. And I am Igor Volovich, the host of the C-Vision International Podcast. Welcome, guys. So the topic of the day is application security. We know a lot of things are going on in the world today, and if you want to make a comment on that, please go ahead. We know everybody's worried about software supply chains, all the unpleasantness from last year. We've seen a lot of the breaches, and of course, our audience knows about those. But if you want to cover anything as kind of a storytelling device to help us understand, help the audience understand the importance of application security, why it's top of mind for a lot of the leaders and the practitioners in the cybersecurity space and the IT space. And I think if we're talking about the convergence of IT and security, we're talking about DevSecOps or SecDevOps or DevOps, whatever the term of art is that your organization uses, all of those encompass these concepts. So if anyone wants to take a stab at kind of going over the broad strokes of what application security is and why we care about it so much today.
I could start. I mean, the phrase, right, is software is eating the world, and we'd like that software to be secure. It's as simple as that, right? Like we're producing more and more software, and software is more and more involved in our lives. I go adjust the air conditioner. It's no longer moving a little physical switch that slides some mercury around. It's actually a computer, right? A little tiny computer that's running software. So it's kind of everywhere. And I would like to have a reliable and secure software world that I live in.
Well, that's an admirable goal. And of course, we've seen the impact that happens when those things are not secure. We've seen the Mirai botnet as a good example, where things that are small, tiny, have little compute, little capabilities, but as an army of bots, they can be very damaging. And we've seen one of the biggest at the time botnet storms, and these were basically IoT devices, right? We had about 200,000, and they put out so much traffic that it laid down a good portion of the internet. So that's definitely a concern. So software supply chains when it comes to business. Let's talk about what the exposure is. What is the threat model when it comes to, and how's it different, right? We know about the old models of, on-prem devices. You've got on-prem data. Of course, all of that's gone away. Perimeters have melted, and they've been replaced by basically permitless, and in many instances now we're moving towards serverless. So it's really all about the applications, about layer 7. And from my perspective, it's also about layers 8, 9, and 10, right? You got the organizational, the cultural. So I don't think any discussion of security today is complete without a discussion of culture and cultural transformation. And so there's obviously an inherent message of evolution there. So do you feel that application security is this evolving space that's really driving a lot of that innovation, driving a lot of that transformation? And how much do you feel organizations need to recognize when it comes to application security that it has to involve cultural change and cultural transformation as well?
Igor, I think there's one element of the cultural transformation that really has changed in the last year, and that's probably due to a couple of factors. Of course, everybody knows about SolarWinds and Microsoft Exchange. Those security situations perhaps reach a tipping point where now we have presidential executive orders on things like software supply chain security. So there's a new level of transparency and insight that a producer of software has to provide its customers. Perhaps there used to be that we could, we could demonstrate the, penetration testing or other forms of evaluation that our software is secure. But now we're actually talking about the internal composition of the software and having to demonstrate that it's composed of components that were well designed and well selected, and that's a cultural change because it's a different level of accountability that we all have in the software that we produce, and that accountability is to some degree, it can feel like it's exposing the internal mechanics of a company that previously didn't have to expose those internal mechanics. And so I think that, an application developer and an application security professional really need to grapple with what that means in their culture of security, which is to design software with the intent of exposing it in all of its glory, in all of its componentry, with software bills of materials and new types of evaluation. So it's going to feel uncomfortable for us for a while, like as a profession, to have that much scrutiny and insight into what previously had just kind of been the sausage making to get to the end product.
Yeah, the sausage making is the hard part, right? Nobody wants to see the sausage made, but everybody wants to enjoy the end product. And now it sounds like as we begin to move a lot more towards API as the model for integrating our business processes, that it's starting to expose a lot of that interior, right? So, and we have to become more transparent. And you mentioned a couple of executive orders, so something that we are very cognizant of in the industry, and of course, myself being here in DC. We're very close to the epicenter of this whole thing. So Executive Order 14028 comes to mind, of course, following SolarWinds and a lot of things that happen around that. The OMB memorandum M2131 talking about continuous monitoring. And we're really moving to what you said, right? The continuous security, right? It's not, let's have a checkpoint, let's have a pen test, let's have a single snapshot of the security posture or the controls within the organization, or down to a level of a single software package. We're looking at the ability to not only collect telemetry, but also do something about the security posture of that particular software component. So, and not only we're talking about software supply chains, we're talking about the continuous nature of this new mandate, right? This new obligation. And we're not talking about just the federal, we're not talking about just a compliance perspective. We're talking about just this is the best practice for doing security in a meaningful way. And then, so how do you tell people about it, right? How do you demonstrate that you are compliant? So what are some of the challenges around that? I'd love to hear your guys' perspective on, you can do this, but also how do you demonstrate that you are doing it?
Yeah, it's a super interesting challenge. And one of the things that's going to be interesting is the incentives that it creates in businesses, right? One thing to create an SBOM, a software bill of materials internally, and talk about it internally. And now you're sort of formalizing what used to be probably ad hoc or maybe somewhat formal conversations at a product team level. But now these are moving up to a much more formal level. And then you have the debate, do I provide this to customers? I certainly do if I'm dealing with the federal government. Right now that's mandated. But if I'm not dealing with the federal government, how do I feel about this, right? And then the other interesting part of that too is, do I actually publish these? Am I going to put on my website, here's my SBOM, right? Here's my product, here's my SBOM, and I'm very open about it. And are you giving your competitor an interesting hint about that really neat open source library you found that makes your product that much better, and suddenly I'm spilling the beans publicly? Like, that is probably not a winning position, and it's going to be interesting. I'm super curious to see how this, you could almost think of the SBOM and being public about it in particular as what used to be closed source businesses getting a little taste of being open source now, right? And how does that feel, and what incentives does it make? Are we going to find commercial software vendors writing more libraries internally and not grabbing Log4j? Mm-hmm. Like, is that better? I'm not 100% sure. Like, Log4j has issues, but they're very public and they're patched quickly. Mm-hmm. Is your team going to be as good about keeping those things patched and reviewed as a piece of open source software? And we really don't know the answer to that. And that's going to be shook out in the next couple of years, I imagine.
Yeah, you mentioned the word team, and I think that brings up a great point, right? The bandwidth availability and the fact that we just have that talent gap and the constraints around bringing talent in, sustaining talent, maintaining and retaining talent, right? That all of those things are part and parcel of this problem set. And we've got over 1 million open cybersecurity positions apparently in the industry. We've got way more than that around the world. Of course, the pandemic didn't do any favors, and everybody rushed into trying to secure whatever they had and then support the new use cases, going to the hybrid workspace, going to remote workspace, and that's still shaking out, of course. So a lot of the efforts got diverted towards doing that and supporting those kinds of business models. And now, as the dust has sort of settled, now we're kind of picking up the pieces and saying, look, how do we go forward from here? And I think one of the big issues is, how do we get the right folks onto the problem, and how do we get enough folks into the problem? And I think that brings up the idea that we're dealing with an asymmetric nature of the threat, right? There are way more bad guys doing bad things than there are good guys defending good things. So what's the answer? Is it automation? Is it building security in early? Is it better architecture, better software security architecture? And where does API security and AppSec security or AppSec, what does that fit in?
Yeah, so I think this is a kind of a multi-dimensional answer here. We can tackle from each individual component, but really we have to look at it holistically, right? As we deal with people and more people, I believe that we should be focusing more on creative thought, surrounding around how we are building our new types of architectural designs and how we are strategizing around that. Meaning, we shouldn't necessarily just be focusing on buzzwords or new tools or whatever that may look like, but rather comprehensively looking at the solution as a whole. How does this actually fit into our program, and how does it actually solve the needs and align better with the business, right? So less on the kind of the resume buffering, so to speak, and more on creative thought and analysis, right? More the logical components. How does a particular individual think or approach a specific type of situation and scenario? I believe that is where we should be heading in terms of hiring processes and training those resources up to be able to fit into the particular role that they actually need to adhere to. But from that, you're gaining a far more aligned resource as a creative thinker, rather than looking at the specific bullet point action items, or bullet point items rather, on a resume of whether or not this particular person fits into that little cubby hole, so to speak. So the roles nowadays are broadening quite comprehensively, and we most certainly need to expand and help bridge those gaps in between what is AppSec, what is tooling, what is automation, and how we can bring that all in inside and make a comprehensive program.
You mentioned program, and thank you for that answer, by the way, David. So the idea of a program, right? Because no one fights alone, and tools alone won't fix it, right? You can have the best, technology partners. You can have the best platforms. You've got the best, even the best, smartest people that know a lot of things, but all of that has to come together. And you said holistic, and I agree with that completely. It has to work as a program. So let's say somebody is starting out on their journey and they're embracing the fact that, we live in an API world now. It's all about application layer. How do they embark on that journey of application security maturity? How do they figure out where they stand today, right? Take note of where they are, take that snapshot, and then lay out the roadmap for moving forward. And what role does partnership play with outside providers like Noname Security? Where do you guys fit into that picture? And how much of that transformation can you drive, support, enable?
Well, one thing I think is, go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, David. I'm sorry.
So I think, a portion of that answer is more positioned on the leadership aspects, right? It's hard as an individual to determine where you need to actually be from an industry perspective. First, coming into the role, not necessarily being in that senior level or distinguished level position, right? So I think it's important as leaders to evaluate our employees to determine and understand as well, what their career aspirations are, and put them on the track to success, while also evaluating where they currently stand in the security space, and how we can build upon them from an education perspective, from a mentoring, from guidance, so on and so forth, to build them into and sculpt them, so to speak, into the individual that not only does the organization need, but also what they're wanting to achieve in their personal aspirations for their career development. So yeah.
I appreciate that. Karl, you wanted to sound off as well?
Yeah, I'm gonna be David and Matt's PR agent for a second. So David and Matt both have our unicorns as professionals because you're also software engineers by trade, and because you're also a software engineer, you are a security professional that is unusual and in sort of like in this acute demand for your perspectives and your skills. That needs to be different in security. I think because we think about the way that we are going to re-engineer application security practices to be based on things like developer self-service, automation, for example. It's going to be impossible for a security team to thrive if the junior people don't also have like software development experience. And so what I kind of worry about, like at an individual level, This is going to sound a little hypocritical because I've been teaching in security programs for a long time, is I just want people to be software engineers first. I want people to be system administrators first. I want people to be network and cloud engineers first, and then we can train them into the security disciplines of how to apply the craft to their skill set. I don't think we have enough pipeline coming from, like I call them, like the traditional IT disciplines. Now that's the person who's going to be like the amazing software security specialist and the amazing cloud infrastructure security specialist. Having a security person who has their first job in their professional life without core engineering training, but like starting out as a SOC analyst, is a really hard. It's going to be a hard road for 10 years because that person doesn't have that underlying like software developer background, and that's the person who's going to be the next David Sharp and Matt Tesauro, is having that kind of that career first, because we need the core IT skill and the security skill both together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you actually nailed it. So what you're really discussing here and is the foundational components, right? And all security is more of a perspective, right? So the difference here is we've built out the fundamentals in each area within technology and approached it from a different perspective, which is malicious, right? To be able to protect against hackers, for an example, you have to think like one, right? And I think it sounds very simplistic and logical, but it's actually exceptionally difficult, right? To be able to think in both perspectives, but you actually hit the nail on the head with the aspect that we need to build fundamental skills before transitioning over into the security side of things. Whereas I believe right now we are seeing a huge surplus of new professionals in the security space without that built-out foundation. And what that equates to is an inadequacy in the core fundamentals of technology, whether it be networking, IT architecture, development, so on and so forth.
Yeah, the other crucial aspect too is that if you've sort of lived the life of the thing you want to now secure, you can be very empathetic and set up systems that will work. Like I remember when CI/CD was starting to be the big thing, and I could remember sort of water cooler conversations with security professionals like, man, our devs are so stupid. Why don't they just do CI/CD? And I thought to myself, have you ever actually set that up for a legacy piece of software? It is a non-trivial ask, right? Yes, you can get there, but there's a lot of work and a lot of steps that go into that. And if you just think it's you go to I don't know, some magic, web UI and tick a box and you have CI/CD, that's not how it works, right? But you might not know that if you're fresh out of college and you just read a thing about CI/CD is good, you should do it. I wouldn't throw you under the bus for having that opinion, but you won't have that ability to make systems because and at the end of the day, there's always going to be fewer AppSec people than developers. I've never seen that inverted, and I doubt I ever will. So how can you expand your reach? Well, that's facilitating, like you're saying, self-service to the development teams, right? And you can only do that in a functional way if you've lived a little bit of their life and understand like, oh, that's a big ask. I can't do that, but this is gravy to somebody who's already doing it. Let me do that instead, right? But you don't have that context or background to make those decisions without living a little bit of the life of, whoever you're trying to secure.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I lived that experience myself many years ago at Microsoft when Bill wrote the big memo, Trustworthy Computing, set up TWC. There were a lot of big cultural shifts. And I remember going, I wasn't a software dev myself. I was in corporate security and I'd been there my entire life. But I did start out on the networking side of the house. And so I built my IT skills, as Matt was talking about. You start out early and you build some foundational base of knowledge, and then you build security on top of that, right? And so I remember when all of our software devs and software developing engineering, SDETs, right? The testers, right? They all got sent to security training, and then SDLC was born, and then we did Bug Bash forever. And these were, we didn't create security engineers. We took existing software devs and networking folks and all the professionals we had on campus, and we added security as a dimension of their capability. So, and I think to all of your points, I couldn't validate that more than I couldn't say enough about it. I think the idea that we now have a lot of folks who have never actually seen any of the underlying technology that they're ostensibly are there to secure. I think that's frightening. I think that creates a certain level of risk that's not perfectly understood. And also to your point, Matt, right? The idea that you've got these folks coming out, they have basically read one book on CI/CD and now they want to do it, right? It's a lot more dangerous when the person doing it is a leader, right? When they're coming from some conference, when they talk to some peer at some event, and they're coming back and saying, well, do we have that? Oh, we don't have that. Okay, we want that. We need that now because at the next event, 3 months from now, I want to be able to say that we have it. That's even more dangerous, right? Because then you have these poorly understood things being applied across the entire organization. And then when it comes to AppSec, that can have very long tails, right? They can propagate, they can have a giant blast radius across the entire org that propagates through the entire risk posture of the org. So I want to talk about that a little bit too. As a leader, what should you be cautious of when you start thinking about application security? When somebody comes to you and, if you're a CISO, a CTO, or a CIO, they say, look, we don't know where we stand on AppSec. We need to start somewhere. We've got exposure. We've got our customers asking for us to expose APIs. We need to talk about things like SBOMs. We need to demonstrate our ability to secure these channels to our customers, to our partners. Where do we start? What are the first couple of things that you need to be thinking about? And what are some of the cautionary tales, right? What do you avoid? What do you need to kind of pump the brakes for as you start running the corner on AppSec and API security?
Igor, one thing that I would, going back in my career, let's say 5, 6, 7 years, that I would do differently as a CISO is I would want to express at that business executive level the degree of accountability that we have that's associated with the software that we produce. That now we're in this world where there's a lot at stake for us to do custom development, right? And what I would be pushing for very heavily, and I hadn't done this before, but I would do this again in a large corporate setting, is I would go back to the executive team and I'd basically say, stop developing software you don't absolutely need to develop custom yourself. How many companies have we all worked for that custom developed things like GRC platforms or custom developed, various internal tooling? It's such a waste of time and energy at this point, because now when you create software, you have an accountability for it. You have a care and feeding, you've got maintenance, you've got these security considerations, you've got all of these implications. And so what I would want to, as a CISO, what I want to do is I want to get ahead of demand as much as possible and make sure that when we're making choices about what custom development we do, we have a really hard gut check at a business level for whether or not this is advisable for us to be in the business of producing this custom software. And probably, I think in the organizations I've been a part of, probably half of it was not really core. It was not really revenue generating, customer product facing software. And I would want us to that's how I would want to shift left on the decision making curve, is just to get ahead and try to convince the organization to stop developing so much custom where it wasn't needed.
Yeah, another fundamental thing I've done with AppSec programs is to you have to fight the desire and a little bit of a push to boil the ocean instantly, right? I need to go slow. I need to understand. I think one of the really, really important thing that I've only ever had once in many, many places I've worked at is a good solid inventory of what's going on, because I have limited resources and I have to spend those wisely. And if I'm burning cycles, FTE cycles on less critical apps because I don't know about more critical apps, I'm really not spending my talent budget very well. And the getting an inventory and kind of slowing down. The other thing is, I think a lot of people will buy a new tool to do SaaS, DAST, SCA, API security, I don't care which. You want to run it at full bore, test all the things. Yeah, it's not a great way, because you're again burning some goodwill with the dev teams if suddenly their Jira backlog goes from 7 to 7,000 issues and they're not actionable at that volume. So why don't you start small? Let's boil the frog, right? Let's do a lightweight test on something, get an idea of, one, does this tool actually give me results I need? And two, can it feed through the existing processes we have at a speed that I can do something with? Because getting this huge backlog of broken, it's a number, and I guess it looked good on some kind of report, but it's not very actionable and it doesn't really move the business forward.
So you actually touch on something quite critical, which is that information, or too much information, can actually serve as a double-edged sword, right? And there's a quite an interesting balance between this and how we juggle between the two, which is, if we don't scan them, well, then we don't know, right? And there is a a risk to the unknowns, especially as we go to introduce a new tool, right? This new tool could shed light into some new risks that we previously didn't necessarily know about. But we also have to be extremely cautious about having a direct automation pipeline, for an example, from that new tool or from the results of that new tool directly into the development backlog, right? So I think that is somewhat of the healthy balance where we, to some degree, scan everything, right? Depending on the tool that we're talking about here, of course. But we are also limiting how much ticket generation or how much information is actually being broadcast, and what the action items are associated around that until there is a settle down period, right? Where we've identified kind of the key critical applications, and we've created action items based on those key critical applications, but we still have a holistic view from said new tool of our entire asset inventory and their corresponding risks.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, we don't want the tail wagging the dog, right? And so when we look at it strictly from an inventory perspective, here's all the things that we have, and as Matt said, fix all the things. That can be a rallying cry, of course, except you're running into 1,000 directions. You're doing everything. Where's the prioritization? Well, it's hard to find, and everybody's running like a chicken with their heads cut off. There's a lot of work happening, but it's kind of a Brownian motion of ions, right? You have a lot of heat being generated, but what's the actual output, right? And so I think from a perspective of risk is where things need to be looked at, right? And so you start talking about, you mentioned business, you mentioned innovation. Let's talk about threat models, right? How do you prioritize this activity? And I think, David, you touched on that. How do we create that filter, a gap between here's all the things that we know, here's all the things that we've discovered about our risk posture. All of these are important, but some are important than others, right? So how do we figure out what's more important? Of course, the real answer is you map it to your business processes and you figure out what's most important, what's most critical, what's your revenue model look like, where's the money coming from, and you map that accordingly. But how do you actually do it, right? That's easy to say, it's hard to do. Where do you start? How do you create the culture for that? How do you create the practice for that? How do you make this a consistent model for determining how risk maps to your application security space, and how you prioritize the work? Where do you start?
Yeah, I actually absolutely love that question. And that is probably one of the biggest gaps in InfoSec. So how do we do it? Personally, I have taken the approach of shifting security from a more of this kind of enforcement-based model into more of a service-oriented model. And what that means is we, as security professionals and leaders, start looking at providing a service, whether it be advisory from tooling, so on and so forth, to the organization, as well as providing a service back to other security teams. And when we shift this mentality, right, it provides far better clarity as well as collaboration between the security team and the different development teams. But where this all fits in as it correlates to risk is we allow the corresponding team, which deals significantly in risk and governance, which is GRC, to then assist and help bridge that gap between security vulnerabilities, whether it be from infrastructure, AppSec, cloud, whatever that may look like, to gather an asset inventory and start to prioritize or add tagging to specific types of assets, where we can then correlate risk or vulnerabilities to an actual financial business impact. And this better helps correlate as well as share that story and create that story specifically to not only the executive team, but also the board.
You remind me of an exercise we did at Rackspace where we just started doing threat models for various pieces of our cloud products. And I sold this to the dev teams because I got pushback initially of like, hey, I don't want to lose my senior dev and my architect for an hour or two, whatever random week that we were doing this threat model. And my sales pitch was, look, I'll get you a diagram of your product, right? And a lot of them didn't even have it, right? They were just moving so fast. They institutionally that, Rackspace knew, but there wasn't like a website, a wiki, something I could go to and see it. So I'm like, hey, burn an hour with me. I'll get you a nice diagram of your product and we'll understand how it works. And we use those threat models selfishly in the product security team to understand which pieces of that product to really nail down testing on. So that was kind of a micro level of that risk equation. And what we ended up doing was this became a program we did over the course of about a year. And we started, Rackspace was very much whiteboards all over the place kind of a location. So we started taping them up on whiteboards around the product security team's space at the headquarters. And we had teams coming over to see, like, I've got to integrate with cloud files. Well, how does it work? Well, they'd go walk over and look at our thing. And then we started actually we started taping string between products. And then we ended up plotting this giant plot of all of Rack's products. And what came out of that was there was this little tiny service, and I can't remember what it was anymore. It did something silly, like you give it a tenant ID and it gives you their home address, right? Something that feels from a risk perspective trivial, but every bloody service called that. So suddenly this little one-off kind of silly little service that you don't think is important is actually a key flow in every piece of our cloud. And honestly, if I'd have looked at that in isolation, I wouldn't have given it much time or love at all as a product security person, because it's a silly little service, who cares? But when everything calls it, yeah, it's important now.
Well, these are the kinds of insights that are hard to come by, right? And you have to visualize risk, which means you have to go get it. You have to get the info, and you either have facilities for it or you have to go facilitate the conversation. And again, you got to have the buy-in to even go do that. I mean, we used to ask, show me your data flow diagrams, and people would say no. We'd say, okay, that's fine. We can help you create that. But in the meantime, we got to understand from an executive perspective, a strategy perspective, that's a dark hole. That's a black box. We don't know what's in it. And, as the saying goes, whenever there is any doubt, there is no doubt. And our doubt is magnified by the fact that we simply don't know what's going on. So we're going to just put a big question mark around your entire product. And then we don't even know what the dependencies are. So now we can't build a threat model. So we got to have to come back. And now it just goes to, just give me your gut call. Like, how important is it? Nobody knows, right? And so as you start filling out your entire enterprise, and turns out half the boxes are black boxes, there's nothing in them. That's scary, right? And then you can show that, you can visualize that. And it seems like that kind of a storytelling device is very helpful. At least it's been to me in the past. So I'm glad to hear you guys did the same thing. And until people see it, they don't believe it. And I know Karl had a comment. I'm sorry, I stepped on you.
Oh, well, David, I have a comment, but David, go ahead. I think you were, joining something.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, there's good news here. The exercise that Matt described going through, several years ago, for applications that are designed in kind of microservices architectures, and they're hosted in any of the public clouds, most services make themselves available to be discovered and mapped like that. And so I think that's the good news, is like that exercise can be pretty quick and pretty automated in a lot of microservices architectures. And it would be, it's obvious that, everybody's moving to public cloud and everything, but what I think this last year, we're still at like 40% of organizations have 50% or more of their workloads in cloud. Okay, so that we're still like 10 years away from having most of that, completed. But yeah, there's light at the end of the tunnel, at least I think, because microservices applications and what the major clouds like AWS and Azure make as services available, do make those practices really suitable for automation and discovery.
That's a good news, right? That's good news. The fact is, it's hard, right? We've got these huge landscapes, and they're only getting bigger, and the software supply chains are only getting more arcane and more difficult to manage. So auto discovery, auto scanning, a lot of that automation, I think automation being the operative word, you start kind of drawing the lines, and the big buckets are, things that we can automate and things that we can't. And so on the one hand, as David talked about, the idea that you have to manage the automation, right? You don't want to just take whatever data you consume and then and action on it immediately, because there's danger there. So you want to have some kind of buffer. You want to have some kind of a filter, some kind of a logic gate where we make prioritization decisions, so we can point our very limited resources in the right direction, hit the big nails that, on the head, and then you kind of worry about the little nails later, maybe. right? But again, you have to understand what the big nail is, because things might look different from different perspectives. And as your exercise pointed out, once you start drawing those strings, turns out some little insignificant thing could be a very critical dependency. So again, understanding that can be hard to discover automatically. So again, you got to have the right folks in the mix. You got to have that right level of knowledge and experience, and it's hard to come by. We know the talent gap is absolutely real. So and there isn't really an easy way to solve it. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. How do we make that more of a consistent practice? And we're talking about security architecture. We're talking about application security architecture. Is this the skill set that really needs to be looked at as kind of the next big talent trend? That we need to be investing in developing those kinds of skills? And also, do we need to write a job description better? That when we're recruiting for those kinds of roles, it's understood that those skill sets may not have a name, right? We may not have a name for that role specifically, and it could be different between different organizations. But how do we create consistency around that? I think is the question I'm asking.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and start us off on that one. So I think architecture is probably the best route, so to speak, to take. The issue is we've become too narrowed in our own kind of realms of technical expertise, but really architecture kind of takes that next step above and looks at it more holistically, right? How do each one of the individual pieces, come together in a much more broader vision. The one thing that you kind of touched on, which is automation, which tends to be quite a big buzzword nowadays. We have to be very cautious about how we automate things, right? Automation is basically an accelerator, right? It can accelerate inefficiencies or it can accelerate efficiencies, right? And so when we look at architecture as a whole, we need to understand that is the automation that we're actually implementing, is it actually strategic in the overall solution or architecture? And or is it going to provide far greater benefit than the amount of maintenance and or problems that it could actually consume by implementing such an automation solution? So, taking that into consideration, I think we need to have much more broader technical expertise. And a lot of the times, a particular architect can manage and review quite a few different teams as well as projects going on. Given the fact that the expertise for architecture tends to be quite more demanding, and the lack of talent that is actually in the industry, it does allow us to fill some of that gap between a lot of the technical resources, which are specific, and allows a little bit of oversight and visibility into each one of the different individual projects, and ensuring that we are being as comprehensive as possible, better aligned to the business.
Yeah, and one thing I've heard used before that I really quite like is this idea, because you have this contention, right? Natural contention between developers want to use the new shiny, and the business just wants to get the thing out the door in hopefully a less, complex, sane sort of way. And so one really interesting thing I heard at some of the DevOps conferences I've been to is this idea of innovation points, right? Every team can go pick their kind of wild hair, cutting edge technology, but only in a narrow defined sense. Like I want to use a database. I haven't used any of my innovation points. I'm going to use my innovation point to get Mongo because it's a new kind of weird NoSQL database and not our traditional RMDBS, right? And that's okay, because you're sort of giving developers some freedom to make some interesting bets on what technology is going to work in the future, but you're not making the entire product based on these like cutting edge things, because that's a reason they call them bleeding edge, because they have sharp pieces that you don't know till you find them. Right. So I really like that idea of sort of trying to do a balance, because it's hard. I mean, there's a lot of gray in between, like what's the right architectural decision. Because I've also worked in larger corporations where the architects on from high said, this is the framework we shall use, and that is it. And it generally that solved the problems, but there are some unique use cases that could maybe be worth burning a few of these innovation points to make a product that was even more compelling for the customers. Because there's that, at the end of the day, you like to sell the customers and make some money. That's always a good thing.
That's why I believe that there's a very positive shift in becoming more service oriented as a security team, right? Is this helps kind of alleviate some of those potential biases and issues, associated around architecture, right? When we are, reaching out to each one of the individual development teams as well as some of the business, business partners to understand what the actual need is from each individual team or product, well, then we have a better comprehensive understanding of what the actual business needs from a security architecture perspective, right?
100% agree.
Oh, I want to double click on something David said, because like the idea of automation as an accelerator, and that's like that's the myth or the danger zone with automation, which is it would be easy to think about automation and think about, oh, that's how I can achieve an objective without having to hire more people, and that might be true, but what you end up doing is you end up having like now even a more hyper reliance on those subject matter experts who can basically operate the factory autonomously. And so it is probably true that there are, the success stories of automation are necessarily accompanied by, and they also had that sort of specialized ninja who could actually capitalize on that automation. You can't automate your way out of not needing that high skilled talent. That's going to make the problem worse rather than making it better.
Yeah, to expand on that, it's really just about showing value, right? Kind of touching back on the architecture, whether or not this is a good architectural design, right? Some of this can actually be visualized, right? Create a logic flow diagram, create a diagram. One thing that I've done in the past, specifically to application security, is creating a logic flow diagram correlated to a vulnerability lifecycle management process, right? And how that actually how that actually goes through each one of the individual workflows. And as that becomes mapped out into each individual stage of a lifecycle process, you start to understand what processes are manual and what processes are automated, to understand where can we create efficiencies. But most importantly, if we do create automation projects and efficiencies, having a show back, having the proof, the data that demonstrates its capability for actually providing value from that actual automation project. And one thing that I've done in the past is ensuring that my personal employees create propositions, right? Create a set of diagram, or not a diagram, a documentation proposing the solution that you're wanting, to push out. What issue are you attempting to solve, and where's the value associated to this particular project?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, look, I think we all get it, and I think our audience probably does too, that, going down the bad road faster, it doesn't get you to a destination unless the bad place is a destination that you always been wanting to go. And that's perfectly fine. Some folks just can't be helped, and we've all been there. But I think if we work for a mature, or at least an organization that's aware of its need for maturity, they're going to take a more of a strategic approach to all kinds of things, including automation, including application security, and understanding where it fits. And I think that split that you talked about, David, understanding how much of that, how big is the bucket, right? The manual bucket versus the automated bucket, and what's the value? I think the value is absolutely a conversation needs to happen. I think, I personally abhor the notion of business security alignment. I don't think they should be aligned. I think they should be integrated to begin with, right? Security should be a dimension, an inherent organic dimension of every business activity. And I think that's lost in a lot of folks, and certainly, we've been having these conversations for a very long time. And I still see business leaders kind of do the sideways head tilt and go, huh, what do you mean? I mean, security is a function, and business has functions, and then you provide me a service, and you secure the thing that I'm trying to build. And we say, well, yes, that's exactly how we got to where we got to. And we're trying not to be there anymore. We're trying to evolve and go to a different place where we are shifting left on security. We also have to shift left on strategy. And, I used to put up this little meme that I made up. It said, in case of architecture emergency, break glass, go back 2 years. And that's really the idea, right? There's no emergencies in architecture. The emergency happened 2 years ago on the whiteboard that you never visited. and or you never paid attention to. And so I think understanding that and conveying that that message to the business leadership to help them understand not only is what the value of architecture and better software design, and I think better means more secure by definition. I don't think splitting the hairs on saying semantically that secure software and better software, I think it's synonymous. To me, it's absolutely the same thing. And I think separating those two, and again, that functional isolation that we've experienced for so many years, I think that's one of these strategic points that needs to be addressed. And I'm curious for, especially as everything is becoming about the application layer, we're living in that space now. Everything's going to the cloud. Our workflows, our data flows, everything's changing, and the perimeters have melted away. The understanding of what an application is, right? And as Karl mentioned, the advent of microservices, everything's being exposed. The transparency that has to exist, right? So not only do you have to expose the functionality, by definition, you're exposing your entire organization, you're exposing yourself to risk. So one goes with the other. So you want the functionality, but you don't want the risk. You can't secure that retroactively. Like, you can't fix these problems that you should have fixed 2 years ago on the whiteboard in production. Screw it, we'll do it live. That's not the message, right? So how do we have that conversation, right? How do we get the business leadership to understand? And I think quantifying that risk is one of the ways. Right? Threat modeling is probably another way. But again, sounds good on paper. How do we actually make that possible? And again, what role do companies that are leading the charge on this, companies like Noname, what role do you see yourself play and with the trends as they're going? Maybe you can talk about that a little bit. What are you seeing from the client space? What are folks talking about? How are they engaging with you to help drive these conversations internally?
Well, I think that the first thing is that the comment about like the automation of like discovery and having literally having your applications mapped and visualized and observed in a way that the security team can just see the landscape. Like that's so much of the battle for the security team, is just to have an accurate, clear, current picture of the space that we're trying to secure. And so I think that the majority of the discussions that we have start with getting that picture clear, because there's an enormous amount of variability then in terms of whether that picture represents the perspective that the security team knew about or had no idea was in place. And so then that becomes the consultative approach, or how do we apply routines for automation or integration with processes according to each customer. But it really starts, the heavy lifting is that initial picture, and just seeing the light in the room for that first.
Yeah, and to add on to that, one of the things I think that's interesting, particularly about our product, and I wish I had when I was at Rackspace, and full disclosure, is that you have the inventory side of the house, but the runtime keeps that up to date, right? So we have these nice interplay between the three different sort of major areas that we work at, where the runtime can also inform how testing happens, right? How do you do your SDLC testing? Well, the runtime knows how your APIs talk. So it can share that with the testing side of the house, right? And it can keep the inventory updated. And the inventory can inform runtime about where are the particularly scary or policy-driven, pieces of data flowing through APIs. I really like how the interplay of our product is there, because when I try to think about, you're going to have to solve the posture, the runtime, and the testing if you have APIs. And if I try to think about doing those with 3 separate pieces of software and making them play nice, at best, I'm going to have to write a whole ton of glue code. And I don't even think that, I don't have confidence that glue code would work really well, right? Certainly not as well as one integrated thing. And it's it's weird, because a lot of times I've actually argued the opposite direction. I wanted to have my SAST from this vendor and my DAST from that other vendor and my SCA from a different vendor. But this is one of the times where I think having all of those coming together in one product really makes it much more powerful.
Yeah, to add to that, I think kind of the real power of Noname is its capability of adaptability, right? Regardless of what environment that you actually deploy it into. So in some instances, even expanding across, even red teaming or, automated testing from the dynamic point of view, right? When you discover new APIs or there's changes to APIs, which is discovered by Noname, you can easily kick off a process almost real time to then conduct a DAST scan that then now is very much targeted on that very specific endpoint on that particular web application or service, right? So it also cuts down the significant amount of scan time to actually scan a web application, and makes it far more targeted, where you can get from discovery to actual intelligence exceptionally fast, within 10, 15 minutes for the most part tops, which is completely unheard of in previous types of architectural designs.
And that's important, right? We want to be closing the gap, the exposure gap, the vulnerability window. And especially when you're talking about custom developed applications where you don't have, a CV, a CV, whatever, right? Advisory from NIST or somebody, right? A CERT, you don't have anything to rely on. You got to get discovered by the bad guys before you know about it. So how do you get there? How do you get ahead of the threat, right? You can do all the pen testing in the world. You can obviously do, but these are expensive things to do. They come around once a cadence, right? Whatever your timeline is, it could be a week, it could be a month, it could be never, right? Somebody forgot to fire off a scan. You never found out about it, right? So how do you close that gap? How do you A, discover it, B, discover it in a way that's credible, meaningful, gives you something to do about it, and gives you an opportunity to close that gap before the bad guys open it. So these are the things that we deal with. Of course, we're talking about accelerating the speed of business. We're talking about supporting innovation within the business, at the enterprise level. And again, that goes down to the level of its single application, innovating, but innovating on rails, right? Giving them the freedom to innovate without going in 1,000 directions, just grabbing the latest, shiniest thing, right? That's important. And of course, that scales up to that level of the enterprise, the level of the business. What kinds of products can you offer to the marketplace? And then, of course, competing. Let's understand that too, right? I think a lot of the business leaders are coming to the realization that security can be a competitive attribute, that if you have a lot of breaches, from a reputational perspective, that's always been something that people talked about, although we haven't really seen it. Look, Target stock never went down. It was a blip, then went right back up after the breach. Nobody cared, right? Because the risk was offloaded to the banks, right? And then the people didn't care. They got their credit cards cut in half, and they came back the next week and they shopped again. So that wasn't an issue. But we're talking about business to business transactions. We're talking about financials, especially fintech, right? You're talking about hospitals. A lot of that data is very private, very confidential. People are worried about it. Disclosure matters. It's not one of these things, well, oh, my credit card got popped. Nobody cares. I'll come back, right? This is kind of one and done. I lived on the street where half the folks got the letter from OPM when we had the OPM breach. Right, so it has a lot of consequences. A lot of folks worry about it, and we're talking about the scale of the problem. Again, as we're moving more and more into the cloud, more folks are onboarding into the public cloud. APIs play such a central role in that. It can't be ignored. And to me, business functions and security, I don't think they need to be divorced. I think they need to come back and be one and the same. It needs to be recognized that way. But the only way to do it is to have these solid architectural practices that permeate every facet of the business. And I think that needs to come from the top. Folks need to buy into that. They need to invest into that. They need to drive that change and transformation. And before you accelerate, it sounds like you do need to transform your thinking about your entire security program when it comes to applications specifically, because, well, guess what? Applications have become the lifeblood of the business. It's no longer about the server. It's no longer about the infrastructure. It's not the network. And it's not the code. It's everything. It's all at once. It's all happening real time now. So I'm curious if you can share your thoughts on kind of the governing trend. One big trend that you see reshaping this industry over the next 3 to 5 years, and how do you predict it? How do you get in front of it? And what do you do about it?
Take a step.
Go ahead, Matt.
So one of the things I'm seeing is that I think how do you say this? It has rained, and we're looking out at our front yard, and we're starting to see mushrooms pop up. Right? I think people are starting to get visibility into the fact that, like, I may be a publishing house, but I'm really a software company, right? And more and more of my business is driven not on physical things, but on software and how that software makes my business function. And like data, right, is the new oil. Well, how do you push around data? You push around data with APIs. That's, I think, where everything is headed. I think we're going to invert the internet, where it used to be, back in the day, handful of APIs, whole bunch of websites. I think there's going to be more API. Well, it's already kind of demonstrated that there's more API traffic now than normal web traffic, right? And so this is a big switch. And like you said earlier, you're exposing core pieces of your business. You have this thin API layer between the end user and your data that's critical to your business, right? That needs to be secure, just fundamentally.
Yeah, so to expand on that, I mean, if we look at, even though history isn't necessarily indicative of the future, what we can see, even if you look back the last 5-10 years, right, and look at how in the last 5-10 years, technology has become more and more integrated into our day-to-day lives, where now we have, full-fledged computers, on our wrist, in our pockets, we have, IoT devices, all these different devices. We are becoming more and more interconnected to technology. And one thing that is trending is exactly that, right? So the growing need for securing that data and ensuring that information isn't necessarily being leaked, or then it gives us a better idea and understanding that the future is going to be more IoT mobile-based devices, and all of that tends to make API calls, right? So we do know with some level of probability, of course, that API security is going to be the future, and we need to basically get ahead of that as soon as possible, given the fact that again, history, giving us the kind of the guidelines that technology changes at an exceptionally fast rate, and it's always better sooner rather than later.
I think there's this continued acceleration, in mobile and IoT are a perfect example of that, where organizations that are sort of struggling to keep up the pace of technology change are just going to start discarding parts of IT that they're just tired of lugging around. Things like user laptops and provisioning laptops to every employee scattered around the world. Like that's the kind of thing that companies are just going to give up on, and they're going to go to solutions that they can adopt that have zero trust principles that isolate users and their experience to applications, those kinds of things. And so I just think that we'll see those that IT baggage just getting dropped, and like a mobile device is a perfect example of the replacements for those legacies. Almost always include a reliance on API as like a connective tissue, rather than the connective tissue that tethered that lug nut to the data center. It's going to be an API call. So
that's perfect. Well, no conversation would be complete without the mention of zero trust, and that was it. So we did it. We checked that box, guys. We did it. Perfect.
Bingo.
Well, go ahead.
No, bingo. I got bingo.
Yeah,
because,
you got bingo. That's right. Perfect. Well, let's do a quick round of parting thoughts. The question I want to leave us with is, if you're talking to a CISO today and they are curious about application security, they want to know where they stand, what would be a question you recommend for them to ask their own team today?
I think an interesting one.
I would have,
Oh.
well, even just like the basic one, how many publicly facing APIs do we have right now? And prove it. Because anybody could say 35, but like, is that based on how many things are enrolled in the WAF? Well, that might be right. It might be wildly off. But that's what I would just start with, is like, what's the quantity of publicly facing APIs you're protecting?
Perfect question. Next.
Oh, Karl stole mine. I was going to say, can you produce a list of all of your exposed apps and or APIs, right? And even just the list of your APIs, or your list of your applications. But then the other interesting thing too is that, like, a lot of people don't consider the sort of second layer of API communication, right? I may have a publicly facing API that if I can attack it, I can now talk to internal APIs as that publicly facing API. And that, from an attacker's perspective, is really interesting, because that externally facing API is kind of a trusted party in a lot of people's minds, right? And suddenly now I have a pivot point where I'm coming from a trusted resource. And as an attacker, I'm really happy about that. I think that's a great thing.
David?
Yeah, Karl stole the show with his answer, right? But that being said, asset inventory is key, right? And what Matt touched on is our attack surface and understanding, what our threats look like, and modeling that out gives us a better holistic understanding of what our attack surface looks like and what the risks associated to each one of our individual assets is going to be on compromise. Again, shifting towards the risk identification aspect associated around our assets, but discovery is key, right? Knowing the unknown.
Perfect. Well, that wraps it up. So thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Karl Mattson, Matt Tesauro, David Sharp, thank you for joining us. And thanks to our audience for joining us for this very insightful talk about application security with Noname. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having us, Igor.